we should shape these countries by helping them establish themselves as democracies. If we did that, his argument was, if we made the world safe for democracy, is what he said, this war could be the war to end all wars. If the United States could manage to shape the countries of World War I into democracies, then the people would be in charge of those countries, and they would never choose to go to war again. This was a wonderful idea, and when Wilson gave this speech to Congress, and when the people of the United States heard this, they supported him, and the United States decided to do away with its isolationism, and we got ourselves involved in the First World War. Sadly, when the war was over, we wanted to rebuild the weakened nations, and that included Germany, our enemy, and Britain and France were not about to let us do that. They said, it's easy for you to want to rebuild Germany. You're on the other side of the world. Germany is our neighbor. They started this war, and the last thing we want to do is rebuild the enemy that just nearly destroyed us. So Wilson, as a man of intellect, was not a man of backbone, and he caved in after the war. And what the nations of Europe did, Britain and France, is they punished Germany. They put horrible stipulations on them. They limited their military, limited their economy, and of course, in this intense feeling of victimization, the Nazi Party and Adolf Hitler arose in Germany, and they came back with a vengeance. Wilson's ideas were not implemented, and he came home to a nation that was extremely disappointed in him. The nation thought, oh, we tried this. He talked us into going to war. We went to war, but the very reason we went to war was never carried out. These nations are not democracies. They're the same, and they probably will go to war again. The result in the United States from this failure in the war, now our side won the war, but we failed to implement our policies. The result of this was an extreme form of isolationism. Americans tried it once, it didn't work. They wanted nothing to do with the rest of the world. We began to cut trade with the world. We began to not focus on anything outside of our country, and we became isolationist. And our isolationist during the 1920s and 30s was so strong that even as the Nazis were rising, even as World War II broke out, and Hitler was running over, he took over France, he took over many countries, he was bombing Britain, our ally. The United States wanted nothing to do with this. And the president at the time was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And Roosevelt knew inside that we must get involved in this war because Hitler has to be stopped. He could threaten the United States. And of course, he knew the American public was not behind him at all. So he was in somewhat of a dilemma. Well, that dilemma was resolved on December 7th, 1941, when Japan attacked the United States at Pearl Harbor. Once again, this was that spark, this was that wake-up call that changed America's mind, and America entered World War II. Interestingly, after Pearl Harbor, the first battles we fought were with Germany, not with Japan. This was what FDR needed to get us involved in the First World War. So Americans went back and forth between getting involved in World War I, extreme isolationism, then our government got involved, very involved, in the Second World War. Now, after World War II was over, so much changed in the world. Britain and France were in no position to tell the United States what to do and what not to do. And the United States, kind of resurrecting some of Wilson's ideas, decided to rebuild the nations we had just fought. The United States, through a program called the Marshall Plan and other aid programs, began to funnel billions of dollars to rebuild Germany and to rebuild Japan. It's worth noting that today Germany is the strongest economy in Europe. Its economy really shores up the weaker nations of the European Union. It's Germany that will bailed out Greece and these other weaker countries. And Germany is an extremely pacifist nation today. We think of them as being warriors, and we think of the French, for example, as being soft. But actually, France has been involved in many more military conflicts since World War II than Germany has. Germany just hasn't. So Wilson's idea worked. Even when we were frustrated with Germany, they didn't want to go to war in Iraq with us. Wilson's idea worked that well. And Japan is a major ally of the United States today, a massive trading partner with the United States. It seemed that Wilson's idea of rebuilding your enemies into trade partners does strengthen these ties and prevent war. A war with Germany or Japan today seems almost inconceivable for the United States. Now, American foreign policy after World War II is shaped by this massive global conflict called the Cold War. The Cold War was the result of World War II leaving only two strong nations left, the United States and the Soviet Union. These two nations fought together against Hitler, but as soon as Hitler was dead, this little marriage of convenience was over pretty quickly. We ended our aid to the Soviet Union immediately when Berlin fell, because the United States, this idea of American exceptionalism, spreading our way of life to the rest of the world, conflicted with the Soviet idea for the same thing, spreading their idea of Soviet culture and communism to the rest of the world. And we rushed into newly freed colonies to try to spread our ways, and the Russians were doing the same thing. It's called the Cold War because we never directly fought the Russians. It was a series of proxy wars where we fought an enemy being supported by the Soviets or vice versa, but no American ever exchanged fire with a Russian during the Cold War. But the world was really drawn into this bipolar system of two superpowers vying against each other. This led the United States, within 5 years of World War II, into a major conflict in Korea, when the North Koreans invaded the South, and the United States, working through the UN, went in and pushed them back. It also led to a major conflict, our longest war, in Vietnam. Vietnam, or what was called Indochina, was a colony of the French since the late 19th century. And France had been so battered by Hitler, they could not hold on to this colony anymore. And we worried that if the French pulled out, that the communists from Southeast Asia would take over, and Vietnam would fall to communism. And then there was this idea called the domino effect, that if one country fell, the one next door would fall, and like dominoes, all Southeast Asia would fall to communism. So the United States paid great amount of money to France to remain there, and when France still decided to pull out, we intervened militarily. And you remember the Gulf of Tonkin resolution that increased presidential power. This was never a declared war, even though over 50,000 Americans would die in the Vietnam conflict. This was a classic Cold War conflict of us just trying to stop the spread of communism. And American foreign policy from World War II into the late 1980s was dominated by this obsession of Cold War. And then in 1989, communism began to fall all across Europe, beginning in Hungary and Germany, and the Berlin Wall was pulled down in Germany, and Eastern Europe was freed. The Russians, the Soviets, could no longer afford to guarantee protection to these areas. And the Soviet Union itself, in 1991, just faded away and was dismembered into 15 other nations, and Russia being one of them. So the Cold War ended. And there was a lot of confusion about what the role of the United States in the world was now, and we jumped on an opportunity without any barrier to our action in the world to increase our intervention in the world. Almost immediately, we intervened in Kuwait under George Bush Sr. We intervened in Kuwait to push Saddam Hussein's army out. But when we pushed him out, we kept our military bases in Saudi Arabia and other places. And this, by the way, is one of the #1 grievances of the late Osama bin Laden. This idea that the United States, this is their perception, that the United States will get involved in something in the Middle East in order to keep a foot there because of its oil resources. Interestingly, the war with bin Laden's Al-Qaeda kind of took over the role of our former enemy in the Cold War. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union no longer existed, but the United States found itself with a new enemy that did not appreciate this concept of American exceptionalism, with our intention on spreading American civilization to the rest of the world. It seemed to conflict with fundamentalist Muslim views. And so the United States found itself in the late 1990s in several events. There was an attack on the World Trade Center in 2003, a successful attack, but it did not bring down the World Trade Center. In 1998, 2 American embassies were bombed in Africa, simultaneously bombed in Africa by Al-Qaeda. A U.S. naval ship, 2 years later, in the Persian Gulf, was attacked by a fishing boat that was loaded with bombs. And then most famously, the next year, in 2001, September 11th was the one that really got the wake-up call to Americans. And the United States, although this has subdued a little, is still embroiled in this war on terror. This is the new Cold War, the new thing that has taken our attention and absorbed our energies in the world. And it's worth noting, and I heard this from a former Secretary of State, that the Cold War was a terrible time. There was the threat of nuclear annihilation and everything, but it was extremely rational. Not justified, but rational. That means it was so easy to understand the world. There were 2 sides. Both of them were controlled by states, by organized governments. Moscow, Red Square, the Kremlin, they were the center of the communist world, and Washington, D.C. and the Pentagon were the center of our side of the Cold War. With the war on terror now, it's much different. It's difficult to understand. There are what are called stateless enemies. Stateless enemies. Al-Qaeda is an enemy that has no capital. You can't go bomb the capital of Al-Qaeda. It has no organized politicians. It's a very decentralized system, and it represents a challenge to the United States, and that challenge continues into the present time in our own lives. Among this challenge of the war on terror, which gets us involved in most every corner of the world, is the growth of other centers of power. The Cold War was called a bipolar world. 2 centers of power, Washington and Moscow. After the Cold War ended, there was one power. The United States was it. But it's not exactly true anymore. Other nations are emerging. Now, right now, the United States still has the largest economy in the world. We have the most efficient and powerful military in the world. But other centers of power are definitely emerging. Russia is returning. And China has emerged. And it remains yet to be seen what the world will be like in the future, as the United States is going to have to come to the realization that our intention on spreading our civilization, if that is the goal that future presidents adopt, will become much more difficult, as there are now more ways than just the American way or the communist way. There are middle paths that nations are forging. India, for example, Brazil is rising, China, and so forth. So we're going from a unipowered world of the United States to a multipolar world, many centers of power. And it'll be interesting to see how this pans out in our history. Thank you very much.